So let's demonstrate how we can read from a file using our Hello World printing program here. And we're going to switch our printer out so that the text that it's going to print is going to come from a file. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of some of this code that we had before. And we're going to go ahead and go into our printer. And if you remember, we have this method print here that prints a certain number of copies. We're going to modify this method to actually use some file IO to read from a file. And the way that we're going to do this is we're just going to basically make this text to print call a method that is going to read from a file that we have on disk. So I'll go ahead and change this text to print. And I'm going to delete all this, and instead I'm going to make text to print equal to get text from file. And then we're going to go ahead and create this method. Then we can go to this method, and inside this method we'll go ahead and implement our file IO. So I created a test.txt file here under C\temp here, and I've put in a couple lines here, line 1, line 2, blah blah, and this is the file that we're going to read. So I'll go ahead and close that out. And the way that we're going to do this in Java is we basically need to use a file reader that is going to read characters or text from a file. So if you remember, we had talked about the two different types of streams, ones that are able to read bytes and ones that are able to read and write characters. So we're going to use the ones that are able to read and write characters. And we can't just open up a file and read it. Or actually we could, but let me show you what that would look like. So I'm going to create a file reader here, and a file reader is a basic type of stream that is able to read from a file. So I'll create this file reader, and we'll call this reader equals new file reader. I'm hitting Control-Shift-O to go ahead and pull that namespace in, and then we have to pass in the file name. So for the file name, we're going to put C/temp/test.txt, and then we need to make sure that we're catching any exceptions that can be thrown here. So I'm going to add this try catch here automatically, and it's going to catch this file not found exception. The other thing that we're going to want to do when we read from files is put a finally block here, and we are going to want to check to see if reader does not equal null. So if we're able to actually create the reader, then we want to do reader.close to make sure that we're always closing the file. And we'll actually want to declare our reader outside of this try block so that it'll be available in the finally. So I'm going to go ahead and declare it here. We're going to set it equal to null, and then we'll initialize it here in the try block. And this reader.close can actually throw an exception itself. And so we're going to catch this exception. And we're just going to leave this basic printing of the stack trace here for now, just to show this example here. So what we're doing here is we're using a file reader, and a file reader is a basic kind of stream in Java that is able to basically read characters, but it's only going to read them one character at a time. So if we look at the methods on our reader here, we can call reader dot, and you can see all these read methods. They return, this one returns an integer. We can pass in a buffer to read into. There's nothing really that's able to read lines from a file. So we could use this, but we'd have to write some code like this. We'd basically have to declare an integer to store the character, because we can only read one character at a time. And then we'd have to say while, and then we'd do C.reader.read. This would read one character does not equal -1. And what this will do is when there's nothing left to read, it'll return us a -1. And then we could do our operations here, one character at a time, and build up a string. And this really is not a great way to do this. This is kind of hard to do and not really efficient. So this is where we can use the kind of decorator pattern in order to wrap some readers together. So the basic way that we typically do this in Java is we would use a buffered reader as one type that can wrap the file reader. And the buffered reader has an interface that's a little bit more friendly for reading text files. So we can create a buffered reader, and we'll call this bReader equals new buffered reader. And you can see the constructor of this buffered reader takes in another reader, anything that implements reader. And our reader actually implements reader. So then we can actually just call that, let's make sure we've got this declared right. So now we have our buffered reader. And our buffered reader, if we look at the methods that are available on bReader, you can see that we have a read line, and this is really what we want to use here. So we'll go ahead and do this. What we're going to do here is we're basically going to declare a string called line, and then we'll do while, and we're going to say line equals reader.readLine, or bReader.readLine. And as long as that it does not equal null, then we'll keep reading our strings. And you can see here we have another type of exception that we need to deal with here. So we can add a catch clause that can catch an IO exception, because when we're reading we can actually throw an IO exception. We're just going to ignore that for now. And then we want to basically return back a string. So we need another string here that's going to be our bigger string that's going to contain all of our text. So we'll say all text. And we'll just do all text plus equals line, and then we'll add a /n here for a new line. This way we get it all in lines with a line separator. And we'll make sure we initialize this all text. We'll just initialize it to a blank string here so that we always have something. And then we're going to return all text. So all that we're doing here is we're basically reading from this file, and we are going to loop through the file, and every time that there's a line, we're going to take that line and add it to our text, and then we'll return that whole block of text. And we've basically used our wrapper here. We created a file reader, and a file reader is basically only able to read one character at a time. But then we wrapped it in this buffered reader, and this buffered reader is able to take in our reader and use it, basically create a new interface above that that allows us to be able to read lines at a time. And then we have our exception handling logic here, and we need to now check bReader here instead of reader. And we'll need to move our bReader up just like we did with the other so that it's available in the finally. And if we did make it down here for some reason, we're going to return an empty string. But the basic way that this is going to work is that we're going to read everything from the file and return that. So now, because our print method is calling this getTextFromFile, when it figures out the text to print, it should get it from that file. So let's go ahead and save this. Let's go into our hello world, and let's uncomment out some of these lines here. So we're going to load paper, we're going to print 3 copies, and then we're going to output page 2. Let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. You can see that we've output line 1, line 2, blah, blah, and then this :2 that we had indicating it's the second page because we had put this in our pages in our code that was printing our page. So that's the basic way to read from a file in Java. And this is not the simplest thing. When you look at what we had to do here, it's really, we had to create 2 different types. We had to pass our reader into this buffered reader in order to get an interface that allowed us to read the line. And we had to do all this exception catch handling here, and then we had to put a finally block to make sure that we're closing and possibly catch this exception. So there's a lot to this, but the basic idea here is that we're using 2 streams here. One simple stream and then a bigger stream to wrap it.